A single room. Rome. The year is around 80. An old man sits at a low wooden table, a guttering oil lamp, a stack of papyrus. He is not writing a memory. He is writing a witness. For men, in 4 different cities, across 4 different decades, will each take up a reed pen and do the same impossible thing. They will try to put the life of Jesus of Nazareth into words. None of them will write the same book. One begins with a genealogy stretching back 42 generations. One begins mid-sentence, with a man already shouting in a wilderness. One begins in a temple, with an old priest struck silent. One begins before time itself, with the Word, and God, and nothing else. For centuries, this has troubled readers. If these 4 accounts describe one man, one life, one death, one resurrection, why does the Church hand us 4 different books instead of one clear, harmonized biography? Some have called it a contradiction, a flaw to be explained away, skeptics pointing to small differences between the accounts, using them to argue the whole record can't be trusted. But look closer, and something else emerges. These read like 4 independent witnesses, each remembering the same events from where he stood. That is not the fingerprint of collusion. That is the fingerprint of testimony. It is not a flaw. It is a strategy. Because no single portrait can hold the whole of a person, a photograph, a voice, a handwritten letter, a memory of him at work, each incomplete alone, each necessary together. The early church pictured the 4 gospel writers beside 4 ancient creatures, a lion, an ox, a man, an eagle, drawn from a vision the prophet Ezekiel saw, echoed again in John's vision of heaven. A king. A servant. A man among men. A soaring, unreachable divinity. 4 faces of one throne. 4 gospels. Tonight, we walk into each portrait one at a time, asking who each writer was, who he wrote for, and what question he was answering. Each man selected his material like an artist choosing brushstrokes, deciding what to include, what to leave out, what to place first, what to save for last. By the end, you will not read the Gospels the same way again. Let's begin where the story insists on beginning, not with a birth, but with a bloodline. Matthew was a tax collector, a man Jewish society had written off, a collaborator, a traitor, a man who... And then a rabbi walked past his booth and said 2 words, "Follow me." Matthew did. Years later, writing for a community of Jewish believers wrestling with an enormous question, how could a crucified carpenter possibly be their long-promised Messiah, Matthew picked up his pen and answered with Scripture itself. He opens not with a manger, but with a list of names: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, 42 generations, marching in order, arriving at one. To a modern reader, a genealogy is something to skim. To a first-century Jewish reader, it was a legal document. It was a claim to a throne. Matthew is saying, before he says anything else, this man has the right lineage, descended from Abraham, father of the covenant, descended from David, Israel's greatest king. Watch how often Matthew reaches for one phrase, so that it might be fulfilled. A star rises over Bethlehem, fulfilled. This is not coincidence. This is a trial lawyer building a case, citation by citation, until the verdict feels inevitable. Even the way Matthew tells the birth story carries this royal weight, the Magi arriving with a question that terrifies a sitting monarch: where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Herod's answer is a massacre. And once the case for kingship is made, Matthew shows us the king's law. He gathers Jesus. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You have heard it said, but I say to you. He speaks of anger the way the old law spoke of murder, pulling the law out of the courtroom and into the quiet of the human heart. He teaches them to pray in words believers would repeat for 2,000. This is a new Moses, on a new mountain, issuing a new law, not to abolish the old one, but to fulfill it, to complete it, to reveal what it always meant underneath. Matthew structures his account around 5 great blocks of teaching, echoing the 5 books of Moses, a Jewish writer telling a Jewish audience, your whole story has been leading here. He gives us the parables of the kingdom, the mustard seed, the hidden treasure, the net full of fish, describing a king establishing a kingdom, right now, in the middle of ordinary life. Matthew alone gives us the keys of the kingdom, handed to Peter, and the courtroom scene of the sheep and the goats, the king seated on his throne, separating the nations, rewarding mercy shown to the least of these. And he gives us the ending no Roman would have chosen, 11 disciples on a mountain in Galilee, receive a book that began with a genealogy proving royal descent ends with a coronation address. That is Matthew's portrait, Jesus as king, not a king like Caesar, ruling by the sword, but a king like David was always meant to be, ruling by. But a king who came only to rule would not be enough. If Matthew is a courtroom argument, Mark is a chase scene. Tradition holds that Mark was not one of the 12, a younger man, likely recording the memories of Peter, blunt and breathless, an eyewitness. Mark writes for Rome, an audience with little patience for genealogies and prophecy. Rome respects one thing above all, action. Power that does something. So Mark gives them no genealogy, no birth narrative, no shepherds, no wise men, no infancy at all. His opening line drops the reader straight into the wilderness, mid-motion. Within 8 verses, Jesus is baptized. Within 13, Mark's favorite word, appearing more than 40 times, is immediately. Immediately he went into the synagogue. Immediately the leprosy left him. Immediately they left. There is no pause in Mark's gospel, the shortest of the 4 accounts, moving like it's told by someone who witnessed it firsthand and can barely get the words out fast enough. A Roman audience understood one kind of greatness, a man of great deeds. So Mark structures his gospel around what Jesus does. 18. A storm silenced with 2 words. A legion of demons driven into a herd of pigs. A dead. Mark rarely lingers on a teaching without immediately showing the power behind it. A paralyzed man sins forgiven, then told to pick up his mat and walk. But Mark's Jesus does something no Roman general would ever do with that. Nearly a third of Mark's Gospel is devoted to a single week in Jerusalem, moving toward a cross. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Not to be served. To serve. In a world where power always flowed downward, Mark presents a figure of unmistakable power who uses every ounce of it in the opposite direction, touching lepers no one else will touch, washing feet no one. And Mark's ending is as abrupt as his beginning. The earliest manuscripts stop at an empty tomb, with frightened women running in silence, no tidy resurrection appearance to smooth it over. Mark was never interested in a tidy narrative arc. He was interested in an urgent one, an account meant to grip a reader by the collar and ask, now what will you do about him? That is Mark's portrait, Jesus as servant. If Matthew shows the king and Mark shows the servant, a third writer, a doctor, historian, a Gentile, set out to show something the other 2 had barely touched, the ones the king and the servant came looking for. Luke never met Jesus. He says so himself in the opening lines of his account, the only gospel writer to explain his method directly, having carefully investigated. Luke was a physician, a companion of the Apostle Paul, and almost certainly the only non-Jewish writer among the 4. That single fact reshapes everything about his portrait. Where Matthew reaches backward into Jewish prophecy, Luke reaches outward into the whole human race, his genealogy running all the way back to Adam, father. This is a gospel written for outsiders, and it shows an almost startling sympathy for outsiders within the story itself. Luke alone gives us the birth of Jesus through Mary's eyes, and sends the birth announcement first to shepherds, men so low on the social ladder their kings receive kings. Shepherds receive a savior. That is Luke's opening statement, and he makes it in a manger. Luke alone tells us of the prodigal son, welcomed home with a robe and a ring and a feast. Luke alone tells us of the Good Samaritan, where the hero. Luke alone tells us of Zacchaeus, a hated tax collector, climbing a tree just to see, and being invited to dinner by name. Luke gives more space to women than any other gospel: Mary, Elizabeth, Anna the prophetess, Mary Magdalene, the widow of Nain, the woman who anoints Jesus' feet with her own tears. In a world where a woman's testimony rarely counted as legal evidence, Luke lets women speak, weep, prophesy, and give at length. He shows a Jesus who eats with tax collectors and sinners so often it becomes a running accusation against him. He shows the thief on the cross, receiving, in his last hour, Luke is also the writer most preoccupied with prayer, Jesus praying before choosing the 12, praying alone before his transfiguration, praying in the garden until sweat falls from him like drops of. After the resurrection, Luke alone gives us the walk to Emmaus, two grieving disciples joined on the road by a stranger who turns out to be Jesus, their eyes opened at an ordinary table, in the breaking. Luke's favorite title for Jesus is Son of Man, insisting on his full, ordinary, weeping, hungry, tired humanity even as it hints at something. This is not distant royalty. This is a man who gets hungry in the wilderness, who weeps openly over a city, who sweats blood in a garden the night before he dies. Luke's history doesn't end with the resurrection. He writes a second volume, The Acts of the Apostles, tracing how this same compassion spread outward from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. That is Luke's portrait, Jesus as the Son of Man, the perfect human being, moving with open arms toward everyone his culture had taught him to avoid. 3 portraits. A king who fulfills the law. A servant who spends his power on others. A son of man who welcomes the outcast. And then, decades later, an old man on John was likely the last of the 4 to write. At the end of a long life, after Jerusalem, he had read the other Gospels, or accounts very much like them, and did not need to repeat their work, Matthew, Mark, and Luke sharing much of the same material, often in the same order. John chose almost none of it. No genealogy back to Abraham. No genealogy back to Adam. John reaches back further than either, before Genesis, before the manger, before time had a first moment at all. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. 6 words that had waited 2,000 years to be written down. John is asking the largest question a human being can ask about another: is this, somehow, God? Jesus uses the divine name God once spoke from a burning bush, and applies it to himself: I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Any first-century Jewish listener would have recognized exactly what was being claimed. Some of them picked up stones. John devotes nearly half of his entire account to a single evening, the Last Supper, and the hours of teaching that followed it. A dead man named Lazarus, for days in the tomb, called back into the daylight, points to a resurrection still to come, for him, and for everyone listening. When the moment finally comes, the arrest, the trial, the cross, John's account carries a strange, settled authority, as though nothing here is happening to Jesus that Jesus has not already chosen. It is finished, he says at the end, in the Greek, a single word, the word a merchant would write across a paid bill. A debt, closed. John alone gives us the doubt of Thomas, refusing to believe until he could touch the wounds himself. A week later, Jesus returns for him, offers his hands. Thomas answers with the highest confession in the entire book, "My Lord and my God." John's own explanation for why he wrote, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Not simply a record. An invitation. That is John's portrait, Jesus as the Son of God, the eagle rising above the other three, revealing the divine identity that was underneath their portraits all along. For writers. For cities. For audiences who needed to hear four different things. John's own explanation for why he wrote, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ." A Roman world that only trusted power proven in action, Mark answers with a servant who used all his power for others. A Gentile reader wondering if this story had room for someone like him, Luke answers with a Son of Man who ate at everyone's table. And a church needing to know whether any of it was more than a remarkable human life, John answers by opening a door back before Genesis. For writers. For cities. For audiences who needed to hear, a Jewish community needing to know their Messiah had truly come, Matthew answers with a king. A Roman world that only trusted power proven in action, Mark answers with a servant who used all his power for others. Take away any one portrait, and something true about Jesus goes missing. And a church needing to know whether any of it was more than a remarkable human life, John answers by opening a door back before Genesis. Take away Luke, and you risk forgetting there was ever room at his table for you. Take away John, and you risk forgetting that the man at that table was never merely a man at all. Four portraits. Held together, they do what no single photograph, no single letter, no single memory ever could. They give us the whole face.